So this week's lecture, we're going to be moving on to the topic of philosophy of time. An important area of metaphysics that we'll be focusing on not just this week, but also in subsequent weeks. And we're starting with perhaps the sort of seminal paper on philosophy of time, at least the one that defined the contemporary philosophy of time, which is McTaggart's paper at the beginning of the 20th century. So McTaggart, as we'll see, very famously argued that time is not real, which is quite a startling conclusion. Now, we'll see this week and in subsequent weeks that not many people have followed him in this conclusion. Not many philosophers even have come to the conclusion that time is unreal. But McTaggart's paper is really seminal in the sense that how people have tried to resist his argument has come to define a range of attitudes in the contemporary debate. It's basically come to sort of frame the contemporary debate in philosophy of time. So the argument's certainly one that people have paid attention to and thought worth taking seriously, even if they haven't ultimately endorsed it. And by understanding that argument better, we can understand the subsequent contemporary philosophical debate on philosophy of time. Okay, so McTaggart's argument proceeds as follows. So first of all, he distinguishes between two ways in which we can distinguish events according to their time of occurrence. So we might think of time as consisting of a bunch of events occurring in some sequence. And McTaggart says that we can distinguish the ways in which they occur in time, either in terms of their what he calls A properties, just a technical term that he introduces, A properties. Properties of being, say, distant past, near past, present, near future, distant future, maybe even sort of finer grained ones like being 2 days past or 1 hour future. Those sorts of things are all A properties according to McTaggart. On the other hand, we have what McTaggart refers to as the B relations, so relations of being earlier than, later than, simultaneous with, also maybe finer grained B relations like being 2 days earlier than, being a year later than, being an hour earlier than, and so on. So those would be the B relations. Now, McTaggart points out that there's a difference between the A properties and the B relations, these two ways in which we might think of events as ordered in time. So the A properties are impermanent. As McTaggart says, for each event, there are going to be times at which it's future, a time at which it's present, and times at which it is past. And it might also have properties of being near future, near past, far past, and so on. But the point is that these properties seem changeable, right? So if we take some event say, the Second World War, the thought is that went from being distant future to near future, to then present, to then near past, to then distant past. So these A properties change. B relations, on the other hand, McTaggart points out, are permanent or unchanging, right? So if some event is earlier than another, then it's always going to be earlier than that other. So if World War One is earlier than World War Two at some time, then it's always the case that the World War One is earlier than World War Two. Right, so McTaggart thinks, as I said, we can order events in time according to their A properties or according to their B relations. And doing so produces what McTaggart respectively refers to as the A series and the B series. So the A series is what we arrive at by ordering events according to their A properties. So we'd have an order with events that are in the far distant past at the beginning, say, and then progressively the nearer and nearer past, then through the present, to the near future, and then to the distant future. So that will give us our ordering according to A properties, or in other words, the A series. Or we could order events according to their B relations, and this produces the B series. So I guess the events that are sort of earliest of all come at the beginning of this series, and then events that are later than those but earlier than most maybe come a bit later. And then progressively we get the later and later events in this series. So we produce the B series that way. Now, it's probably worth pointing out that, as you might expect, these orders are presumably going to be the same, right? So the earliest events, the events that are, according to the B series, come at the beginning of the order, are also going to be the most distant past events. So events that are going to come according to the A properties at the beginning of the order. So the A series and the B series are going to line up, presumably. They're going to give us the same ordering. But it's just two ways of imposing that ordering. So we can impose it either by considering the A properties or considering the B relations. That seems to be McTaggart's point. So McTaggart's going to draw upon this, in particular, the notion of the A series, to argue that, in fact, time is not real. So, as I say, a surprising argument with a surprising conclusion, but nevertheless, it seems a very interesting argument. So the basic structure, I'll describe the basic structure of McTaggart's argument, and then I'll go into a bit more detail about each of its stages, and we'll look at how plausible each of its stages are or aren't. So the argument in outline is as follows, right? So it starts with the premise one, that there can be no time without change. So McTaggart claims that there can be no time without change, and we'll come on to what that might mean shortly. He's then going to argue that the A series, so remember we distinguished this A series from the B series, so he's going to argue that the A series is necessary for change. Again, I'll elaborate on that shortly. Then he's going to claim that the A series is contradictory. And from the fact that the A series is necessary for change, premise 2, and the fact, according to him, that the A series is contradictory, premise 3, it seems to follow that there is no change, that change can't exist, right? So we infer step 4, an intermediate conclusion, that there's no change. So if A series is necessary for change, but A series is contradictory, then it seems, well, there can't be an A series because it's contradictory, but the A series is necessary for change. But if there's no A series, then it seems to follow that there's no change either. And then the final step, so McTaggart's inferred that there's no change, but also, so that's step 4, but also from premise 1, he has the claim that there can be no time without change. So if there can be no time without change, but there's no change, it seems to follow that there's no time, or in other words, that time does not exist, which is McTaggart's overall conclusion. So that's the basic form of the argument. It's quite a lot to take on board just in that abstract form, but we'll discuss the various premises in turn. So the first premise is McTaggart's claim that there can be no time without change. Now, McTaggart doesn't actually really provide much by way of an argument for this premise. He seems to take it as obvious or somehow unassailable, that there can be no time without change. Now, I suppose we might try to kind of bolster this claim by showing the difficulty that we have in conceiving of or imagining a universe in which nothing changed, right? So we might think that, well, if we really try to seriously conceive of a universe in which nothing changes, then we've got a timeless universe, and that would be presumably McTaggart's thoughts. So I can try to conceive of a universe in which nothing changes, and I might think that, well, maybe I can imagine that there could be a universe in which nothing changes, but still there's time. What am I imagining when I do so? Well, perhaps I'm imagining, staring out into blank space, nothing going on. And maybe I'm becoming increasingly bored as I'm staring into blank space, and so we've got a sense that time is passing. I'm getting more and more bored, even though there's nothing going on in this space. There are no events occurring. There's no change, in other words. But what McTaggart would surely point out is that when I'm imagining this, actually, I'm not really imagining a universe in which nothing at all changes, right? Because although I'm imagining one in which there are no events occurring external to me, nevertheless, I'm supposing that my conscious state changes. So I'm getting more and more bored, for instance. So something in that universe is changing. And it's that change that gives us a sense that there's really time elapsing in that universe. So the fact that at least my conscious thoughts are changing, gives us this sense that really time is elapsing. Now, McTaggart's presumably going to think that if really nothing changed, either sort of in the sort of external world or in terms of the conscious experiences of any observer or conscious thoughts of any observer, nothing at all changes, then that's a universe that genuinely doesn't have time passing. So, you could dispute this. So this is a big question: is it possible to have time without change? But it's a premise that at least seems to be worth taking seriously. And if we endorse it, it's sort of interesting to look at what follows. And ultimately, McTaggart's going to argue that the non-existence of time follows from this, interestingly. So what about premise 2? So premise 2 was this claim that the A series is necessary for change. Now, McTaggart does provide somewhat more of a justification for this premise. So McTaggart claims that the B series alone isn't sufficient for change. We need the A series in order to give us genuine change, and not merely the B series. And the claim here is reasonably straightforward. So the idea is that, well, the B relations which define the B series are immutable. They're permanent or unchanging, right? So we already saw that if, for instance, World War I is at one time prior to World War II, then at all times it seems World War I is prior to World War II. So events just don't seem to change in the B relations that they bear to one another. So, on the other hand, we saw that the A properties that define the A series do change, right? So it seems that events go from being future to present to past. And so this seems to be a sort of genuinely changeable set of properties. And so McTaggart thinks that really, in order to have change, we really need the A series and the A properties, and that the B series or B properties won't suffice. So that's his thoughts about why the A series is necessary for change. Okay, so we'll grant that at least for the time being. Suppose that McTaggart's right about that. Premise 3 of McTaggart's is that the A series is contradictory. Now, how does McTaggart argue that? Well, McTaggart points out that, look, the A series is defined in terms of these A properties, like, for instance, past, present, and future, or if we like, even more distant past, near past, present, near future, distant future, or 1 hour future, 2 hours future, those sorts of things. But McTaggart's going to point out, or he does point out, that those A properties are incompatible with one another. Right, so it's incompatible, he claims, for instance, that some event should be past, present, and future. Right, so it's incompatible, according to him, that, say, World War II should be past, present, and future. However, McTaggart thinks that to suppose that they exist, these A properties exist, to suppose, in other words, that the A series exists, is presumably to suppose that each event has all of these properties, right? So it's supposed to be in the nature of the A series that World War II, say, goes from being future to present to past. So it seems in some sense to possess all of these properties, even though these properties, according to McTaggart, are incompatible with one another. So how is it that World War II can be future, present, and past? That seems not to make sense, according to McTaggart. So McTaggart thinks that the supposition that events have A properties and stand in this A series leads to a contradiction, from which it follows that, well, contradictions can't be true, so it must be that actually, after all, events don't have these A properties or stand in this A series. Now, you might, at this stage, have a reservation about McTaggart's claim, and I think this sort of reaction occurs to most people. In fact, it's so natural a reservation about McTaggart's argument that McTaggart himself calls it the natural objection, right? So you might think, well, look, McTaggart has done something a bit suspicious here, right? So he said that, look, it's contradictory for an event to be past, present, and future. And you might say, yeah, sure, it is contradictory for an event to be past, present, and future, if we're supposing that it has all of these properties at the same time, right? So it would be a contradiction for World War II to be at once past, present, and future. So in other words, past, present, and future all at the same time. But you might say, well, look, nobody's claiming this, right? So nobody thinks that events have the property of being past, present, and future all at the same time, right? Rather, what we think is that at one time it has the property of being future, at another time it has the property of being present, and at still another time it has the property of being past. And you might think, well, look, no contradiction there. There's no contradiction between having these different A properties at different times. So it would only be contradictory to suppose that events have these different A properties simultaneously, and there's no contradiction in supposing that an event has them successively. So this is the natural objection to McTaggart's premise 3. However, McTaggart is aware that this is a natural move to make and argues that there's something, in fact, problematic about this response to his argument. Specifically, he argues that this so-called natural objection involves a vicious circularity or a regress. So, specifically, what he says is that in making this objection, we're presupposing the notion of time and tense. So we're presupposing the notion of time and tense in order to explain the compatibility of the A properties. So I'm saying specifically, when I respond to McTaggart, that it's not a contradiction for an event to be past, present, and future, provided it has those properties at different times, right? But there's me presupposing the notion of time. So I'm saying if it has them at different times, this is no contradiction. So I'm helping myself to this notion of time. Or I could do it in terms of tense. So I'm saying there's no contradiction to suppose that something is present, was future, and will be past, right? So there's me helping myself to the notion of tense in order to explain that there's no contradiction here. But McTaggart says that this is an illicit move, so I'm not entitled to presuppose time or tense in my explanation of why there's no contradiction in the A series. Precisely because, according to McTaggart, the A series itself is needed to account for time and tense. So in other words, McTaggart thinks that I'd be going round in a circle. I'd be presupposing time and tense in order to show that the A series is coherent. But the coherence of the A series is precisely what's needed in order to show that time and tense exist. So McTaggart accuses the natural objector of a kind of vicious circularity or perhaps a regress. So just to put that in another way, so McTaggart starts out in his premise 3 by saying, look, it can't be of some event like the Second World War, that it is future, it is present, and it is past. That's a contradiction. The natural objector says, well, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that this event was future, it is present, and it will be past, or something like that. But McTaggart then is just going to respond to this that by saying, look, the natural objector is presupposing tense and therefore time, this distinction between is, was, and will be, which is the very thing that the A series is needed for, right? So we need the A series because the A series gives us change, and change is needed for time. So I can't help myself to the notion of time and tense in order to show that the A series is coherent. Okay, so essentially, McTaggart has a circularity objection, and so he thinks that therefore he's satisfactorily supported premise 3. Now, there might be comebacks for the natural objector. I think this is one of the more interesting things to think about in McTaggart's argument. I mean, I think all of the premises are interesting and potentially open to debate, but you might wonder, for instance, whether McTaggart's response to this natural objection is persuasive. So you might think, well, okay, it's true that in order to show that the A series is coherent, I maybe have to rely on the notion of time, presuppose the notion of time. So, yeah, maybe in a sense there's some circularity, but you might think, well, why is the burden on me, the natural objector, to show that the A series is coherent? Why can't the burden be on him to show that it's incoherent? Why do I have to prove that it's coherent? Why is it not the case that he has to prove that it's incoherent? And it's true that, if we suppose that I have to prove it's coherent, then all I can do is engage in a kind of circular reasoning. But, so what, you might think? You might think when it comes to basic notions, right, it's very difficult to explain them, or maybe impossible to explain them without some sort of circular reasoning, and that's what it is for them to be basic. So, for instance, imagine trying to explain what space is without falling back upon any spatial notions or spatial vocabulary. We might find that very hard, if not impossible. Does that show that space is incoherent or doesn't exist? Well, not obviously. It could just show that it's basic and it can't be reduced to anything else, or in other words, explained in any other terms. So as soon as we try to explain it, our explanation looks circular. So you might think, circular explanations isn't a sign of incoherence or contradiction. It's just a sign that a certain notion is basic. So that might be space or that might be time. Okay, so that's a sort of line that one might have in resisting McTaggart's response to the natural objection, but for now we'll suppose, or maybe grant, McTaggart's response and suppose that that premise 3 is in fact true. So McTaggart obviously thinks, well, the notion of an A series then involves a contradiction, so there can't be an A series. And obviously he thinks time essentially involves the A series because change is essential to time and the A series is essential to change, so he infers that time doesn't exist. Right, so he's got this argument, and we might think, well, look, maybe there's some sort of room for questioning the premises, but, there's also something to be said maybe for the premises. They're not ridiculous premises. And the argument seems to be valid on the face of it. So maybe it's at least an argument worth taking seriously. But the conclusion time is unreal seems quite unpalatable, right? So you might think, well, but surely we just experience time. So you might think, well, if we experience time, it's got to be real, right? So it must be the case that something's gone wrong with McTaggart's arguments. Maybe, after all, one of his premises was false, or maybe the argument was invalid and we just didn't notice. Certainly, you might think that actually accepting the conclusion would be somehow worse than rejecting one of the premises. And I think that McTaggart kind of sees this danger too, right? So he sees that, we might be so troubled by the conclusion that time is unreal that we might think that his argument just provides a reason for being skeptical about one of the premises or perhaps the validity of the argument. So he does something to sort of address this concern that the conclusion is just hopelessly implausible. And this effort is devoted at showing why we should think that our apparent experience of time is not veridical. So it's not accurate to reality, right? It's illusory in some sense. So obviously he thinks it's illusory because he thinks time's unreal, but he thinks that we have independent reason for that, even before we accept the conclusion that time's unreal, he already thinks we have reason to doubt the veracity or veridicality of our temporal experience. So yeah, you might put it like this, right? So our main reason to believe in A properties and therefore change in time is that we seem to experience the world as having A properties. So you, for instance, have direct perceptions of the present that are phenomenologically different from your memories of the past or your anticipations of the future. So this sort of differential experience, the difference between our experience of the present, which is very vivid, and our memory of the past or our anticipation of the future, and also the fact that our vivid experience of the present changes over time, might give us reason to think that there are these A properties in the world, that there's this sort of changing presentness and corresponding changing pastness and futureness. But McTaggart thinks that this sort of experience of the world as though it had A properties is in fact illusory. So he points out, for instance, that our impressions of time, for instance, the present, couldn't correspond, in his view, to anything objective, right? So he points out that, it's true that we might feel that we sort of experience something like a present, and you might infer from that we have reason to believe that there is such a thing as a present, but actually McTaggart's going to say actually what we experience as present couldn't in any case correspond to an objective present, even independently of his arguments that time is unreal. So for one thing, he points out that our experience of the present and our temporal experience generally is variable and subjective. That the experiential present, the things we experience as though they were present, couldn't correspond to anything objectively present. So sometimes the experiential present is known as the specious present, by its detractors, I suppose, by those people who think that it couldn't correspond to anything objective. So this experiential present is, if you like, the set of events that one experiences as being present. Now, McTaggart points out that this couldn't correspond to anything objective because the experiential present, or specious present as he calls it, is not an instant, but rather an interval. Now, this actually can be shown. So, I've cited at the bottom of the slide a paper that surveys some of these psychological experiments that are interesting on how we human beings experience time. And it's actually fairly well established that what we experience as present isn't an instant, but rather is an interval of time. So, for instance, if experiments can be conducted in which two noises are emitted at equal distances from a human being, and the human will experience the noises as simultaneous, even if in fact there's a short temporal gap between the times at which they're emitted. So in other words, we're not able to make very superfine distinctions between moments in time or events occurring at different moments in time. Rather, we'll tend to experience even events that occur at slightly different times as occurring at the same time. So this would be one example of how the experiential present seems to be an interval rather than a moment or an instant. Whereas you might think that if there were an objective present, then it would have to be an instant, right? So you might think there's sort of part of the concept of a present that it's a moment in time and not an interval. I'll go into that in a bit more detail momentarily. Other phenomena, psychological phenomena that maybe show that there's some problem in supposing that the experiential present could correspond to anything objective are, for instance, that the experiential present, maybe even granted it's an interval, doesn't seem to be a constant interval. So you have these weird, I don't know if anyone's had this experience, but you may well have, and it seems to be experimentally verified, whereby if you're in danger, then time seems to slow down. So actually what seems to happen is you seem to discriminate more moments of time or more events occurring at different moments in time than you ordinarily would. So your experience of a moment of time seems to be more fine-grained. You seem to be making more discrimination. So maybe the experiential present is a shorter interval rather than a longer interval in situations of danger. And there might be a sort of evolutionary kind of Darwinian explanation of why this should be so, because it might be really important to survival that in situations of danger you're able to experience events in a very detailed, fine-grained way, so that you're able to respond to them, for instance. So you get this. So this would be a sort of an example of what might be called experiential time dilation. So it seems that time slows down. You can get the converse phenomenon experimentally of time contraction. So maybe time speeds up, or you make less fine discriminations. Even it's been experimentally shown, and again, if you're interested, you can look at this Eagleman paper that I mentioned on the slide. You seem to be able to get a phenomenon of experiential time order reversal. So in certain situations, even though, say, sound A is emitted earlier than sound B, actually, even though they're at the same distance from the observer will observe sound B as occurring prior to sound A. So you actually get this other strange phenomenon in certain contexts of time order reversal. So these sorts of phenomena, McTaggart mentioned some of them, but the ones that McTaggart mentions, plus some others, seem to be actually vindicated by contemporary psychological literature. Seem to show that our experience of time has this variability to it. In particular, our experience of the present, it's variable. It's an interval, but a variable interval, depending on our circumstances. And maybe this all adds up to something of a case that our time experiences, our temporal experiences, it's dubious to construe those as corresponding to something like objective time, right? So if there is an objective time, we might think, well, the present surely has to be an instant and not an interval. Surely the rate of flow has to be constant. The if you like, the width or the extent of the present has to be constant. And you shouldn't get sort of time order reversals or anything like that. So, it then starts to look as though our experience of time couldn't really be itself be an experience, straightforwardly an experience of anything that's objectively out there in the world. So this is McTaggart's claim that the specious or experiential present couldn't correspond to an objective present. So, as we said, for instance, it's plausible that the objective present is a point and not an interval, right? So a moment rather than an interval of time. So actually, a kind of, we don't just have to appeal to intuition here, right? So it does seem sort of intuitive that an objective present should be a moment rather than an interval. But actually, there's an argument for it, which goes back to St. Augustine, which is that, well, if the present were an interval rather than a moment or an instant of time, then there would be earlier and later parts of the interval, and the later parts would be in the future of the earlier parts. The earlier parts would be in the past of the later parts. And this just seems to make no sense, right, according to this sort of Augustinian line of reasoning. So you might think, look, it just seems a contradiction in terms that the present should comprise parts that are in the past or future of other parts of the present. That just doesn't seem to cohere with what we mean by present. So, but yet the experiential present does seem to in these experiments comprise parts that are earlier and later than other parts. And so you might think the experiential present couldn't correspond to anything objective. So all of this kind of maybe casts some doubt, or at least this is what McTaggart hopes, upon our reason to believe in the existence of an objective present, or generally an objective A series, because you might think, well, our main reason, as I've said, for believing in an A series or believing in the passage of time and so on is our experience, right? It seems to us that time passes. It seems to us that there's a moving present. But if we've now seen that actually our temporal experience, our experience of the present couldn't really correspond to anything objective, then what further reason do we have to believe that there genuinely is an objective present that somehow differs from this experiential present? So this might, if we accept this might make McTaggart's conclusion that time is unreal more palatable after all. Okay, so I think this slide just repeats some things I've said. So that the idea is that McTaggart's tried to show that his denial of the reality of time is not so paradoxical after all. We might have thought that his argument seemed paradoxical, at least the conclusion seemed paradoxical, that the time is unreal because it was incompatible with our experience. However, he's now sought to show that our time experience, centering on the experiential or specious present, is illusory, and so actually provides no reason for believing in an objective time, in objective reality of time. But you might think that, well, okay, actually McTaggart's arguments that time is illusory maybe don't show all that they're intended to show. So you might think, well, for instance, if we experience the illusion of time, then at least something is changing, right? So experience itself is changing, right? So the idea is that, okay, at one time it seems to me that such and such is present, and then it seems to me that so-and-so is present. So you might argue that, my experiential present can't correspond to an objective present. However, even describing what's going on for me, even in describing my experiences, I'm describing change, right? So it seems that such and such is present, and then it seems that so-and-so is present. So my conscious phenomenology is changing. So doesn't this just immediately show that there is change in the universe, right? So even if it were only a very experience, there would be something. It looks like, just that we have a very direct evidence of experiential change. What appears to me present is constantly changing. What is particularly vivid to me is constantly changing. So it seems we have very direct evidence for change, and change is what was required for time. So perhaps there's an objection to McTaggart this way. You might also think that actually a lot of these psychological experiments that seemed maybe to provide some support to McTaggart, actually it's sort of dubious that they do, because if you think about the way that we describe the experiments, so they seem to presuppose a notion of objective time, right? So for instance, if we're talking about the fact that we experience an interval as present rather than a moment, well, we seem to kind of already presuppose that the sounds were emitted at different objective times, but that this was somehow conflated in our experience. So we're already kind of supposing that we have an independent handle on what constitute different objective times and maybe past and future objective times. So maybe again, although it might be that our experience of time couldn't perfectly correspond to anything objective, nevertheless, we're presupposing we have some handle on objective time, even in trying to argue that we're subject to some temporal illusions. Okay, so there's certainly grounds for questioning what McTaggart says here. So one way or another, I think it's fair to say that there are various points at which you can resist McTaggart's argument. As we've seen, so we can question the premises, right? So maybe you could argue that, for instance, it should be possible to have time without change. So you might question McTaggart's premise 1. We also discussed that you might challenge his premise 3 that says that the A series is incoherent. So we considered the natural objection and whether McTaggart's response to the natural objection was compelling or not. Maybe you might even question premise 2, which was the premise that the A series is necessary for change. You might maybe argue that the B series is enough or something like that. We'll come back to that in a moment. So there are various sort of places that you might question McTaggart's argument. You might question whether it's valid, although it does kind of look valid. So it might be more plausible to challenge the premises. And you might particularly think, well, if we're not totally convinced that McTaggart's shown that experience provides no reason for believing in the existence of objective time, we might think in particular that something's gone wrong with his arguments. So we might, scrutinize the premises that much more and think really somehow we've got to reject one of these premises. So, I think that basically it's fair to say that the majority of contemporary philosophers do reject one or more of McTaggart's premises for various reasons, some of which we've considered, and therefore reject his conclusion that time is unreal. So the majority of contemporary philosophers believe that time is real, it's fair to say. But what's particularly interesting, I suppose, is that there's no consensus on which part of McTaggart's argument, which of the premises, that is, should be rejected. And different philosophers have rejected different premises and therefore arrived at very different views about time itself. And that's the sense, I think, in which McTaggart's article has helped to frame the debate in contemporary philosophy of time, because the various ways in which people resist it actually have defined various traditions or various ways of thinking about time. So this is particularly notable with what are known as the A theory and the B theory. So the very terminology alludes to McTaggart's distinction between the A properties and A series on the one hand and the B properties and B series on the other hand. So so-called A theorists, so these are two prominent theories of time in the contemporary literature. The A theorist thinks that the A properties and the A series are real, right? So they reject the idea that the A series is incoherent. So maybe they endorse the natural objection. So they think, that there's genuine past, present, and future. And they also think that, these are different from B relations. They're not reducible to B relations, but they're something in their own right. And, they might endorse McTaggart's claim that the A series is necessary for change. They might also endorse his claim that change is necessary for time. But they believe that there are A properties, so they've got no problem with that, because the A properties can give us this change and therefore time. So events change with respect to their A properties. They go from being future to present to past and so on. And so the A theorist tends to think of the passage of time, the movement of the present, if you like, as a real objective feature of the world and not an illusion. As you can see, they've basically rejected premise 3 of McTaggart's argument that the A series is incoherent, maybe by endorsing the natural objection and rejecting McTaggart's response to the natural objection. But they could perfectly well accept, if they wanted, premises 1 and 2, provided they reject premise 3, then they can still endorse the reality of time. Now, B theorists take a different attitude towards McTaggart's argument. So B theorists hold that the B series is really all there is to time, and they basically differ from McTaggart in the sense that they think that actually we don't need the A series for time. So the B series on its own is enough for time. So, for instance, I suppose most of them will take issue with the claim that the A series is necessary for change, which is McTaggart's premise 2. They might reject the idea that change is necessary for time, but I think probably the most of them are happy with the idea that there is change, but just reject the idea that the A series is necessary for change, and they think that the B series is enough for change. But B theorists will tend to agree with McTaggart that there is no A series, that there's something problematic and perhaps even contradictory about the A series. But certainly they tend to think that there are no genuine A properties, or at least no A properties that can't just be reduced or analysed in terms of B relations. So sometimes they're characterised as believing there are no irreducible tensed facts, but only tenseless ones, so no irreducible A properties. B theorists might try to make sense of our talk about A properties without endorsing their fundamental reality. So it seems fairly clear that in ordinary language we do talk as though there are A properties. So I will say, look, World War II happened in the past, that the war between Russia and Ukraine is happening in the present, and I might say maybe there'll be a World War III in the future. So, I do use these kind of A terms of pastness, presentness, and futureness, and that's a very common way of speaking. So the B theorist is normally going to want to say, okay, yeah, it's fine to speak that way, but when I talk about past, present, and future, I'm not really picking out some fundamental properties of the universe. So actually what they're going to try to do normally is to sort of explain this talk of past, present, and future actually just in terms of B-theoretic relations, in terms of B relations. So often the B-theorist will say something like this: well, our talk as though there were A properties is actually a kind of indexical talk, right? So an indexical is a word or a phrase, the meaning or reference of which depends upon the context in which it's uttered. So, for instance, a classic example of an indexical word is the word I. So, when I say I refer to a different person than when one of you says I. Likewise, spatial expressions, many spatial expressions are well known to be indexical. So if I say here, then I refer to a different place than when one of you says here. For instance, if I say So if I say here, now would be another example, right? So arguably, so if I say now, then I refer to 4th of March, which is when I'm recording this in 2022. But suppose that you watch this on Monday, then if one of you says now, then you refer to a different day, a different time. So those are indexicals, examples of indexicals, examples of words or phrases whose meaning or reference depends upon who utters them, in what context they utter them, and so on. And the B theorist is going to say that basically A expressions, so the words like past, present, and future, are examples of indexicals. So, for instance, if I say the Great Depression is past, so this appears on the face of it to be reporting a tense fact or an A property, so attributing the A property of pastness to the Great Depression. But actually, the B theorist is going to say, well, it appears to do that, but it's not. There's no real sort of genuine metaphysical property of pastness. But actually, all that I'm doing when I say the Great Depression is past is reporting a tenseless B series fact that the Great Depression is earlier than the time that I'm speaking. So when I now say the Great Depression is past, that simply alludes to the B relation that the Great Depression is earlier than, so earlier than being a B relation, earlier than the time at which I'm speaking. So you can see how this is indexical, because if I in 2022 say that the Great Depression is past, thus in effect saying the Great Depression is earlier than the time at which I'm speaking, then I say something true. Whereas if somebody in the year 1700 said the Great Depression is past, then they'd report something false, because they'd be in effect saying the Great Depression is earlier than 1700, which is false. So, in other words, for the B theorist, the A expressions don't really report genuine properties, or genuine A properties in the world, but really they're to be understood in terms of B relations, right? So the B relations are enough to make them true. So, I suppose one might argue that, and I think the B theorist would normally be comfortable with this, saying that on their account, there's no genuine passage of time, right? So, for the passage of time, we'd seem to need a genuine present that sort of moves, right? So, maybe World War II has the property of being present, and then I don't know, sometime later, the Russia-Crimea War has the property of being present. And so that looks like a sort of, there is this property of this metaphysical property of being present, and that the events that have that property, what events instantiate that property, changes, right? So giving us a genuine passage of time. But of course, the B theorist denies that there's a real property of presentness, and so presumably is going to deny that there's a real objective passage of time. So they're normally kind of with McTaggart in thinking that this sort of appearance of the passage of time is an illusion, actually. And so, whereas the A theorist will normally endorse the passage of time as something genuine, and might indeed appeal to our experience as one reason for believing in it. So you might worry about the B theorist here. You might think, well, maybe the passage of time is essential to the concept of time. So you might think, well, is the B theory does it really do justice to time, or are they, kind of secretly, kind of in McTaggart's camp, really denying the existence of time because they deny the existence of passage? So that's sort of one way that the A theorist might object to the B theorist. They might say, look, you don't really believe in time because you don't really believe in passage, and passage is essential to time. And they might moreover say, look, we've got this experience of passage, which, whilst it maybe doesn't correspond perfectly to objective passage, at least gives us reason to think that there is an objective passage of time. So they might sort of seek to defend the A theory on those grounds. On the other hand, the B theorist might kind of turn around and respond to the A theorist by pointing to potential problems with the A theory. So one well-known issue with the A theory, or objection to the A theory, is the so-called rate objection, right? So B theorists have said, well, A theorists believe in the passage of time, but if time passes, as the A theorist says, then surely there must be some rate at which it passes. So if we're talking about it moving or flowing, then it seems to make sense to talk about the rate of movement, or the rate of flow, or the rate of passage. But you might think, well, we can't really make sense of the rate of passage of time. What are we going to say? How fast does time pass? Does it pass at 1 hour per hour? That somehow seems an unsatisfactory answer. You might think that in order to measure how fast time passes, we need some reference point external to time. So maybe if we had two streams of time, we can measure the passage of one in terms of the passage of another. So just as we can measure the speed of one clock using another clock, but so long as we don't think there is more than one sort of stream of time, more than one time dimension, then we might think that this talk of the rate of passage just doesn't make sense, and that might give us reason to doubt whether there really is any objective passage of time. There's another sort of objection to the A theory, and we'll maybe say a bit more about this in subsequent weeks. And this is an objection from contemporary physics. So the theory, in particular Einstein's theory of special relativity, seems to imply that there's no absolute simultaneity. So in particular, what it implies is that different frames of reference, where a frame of reference is defined by velocity, imply different relations of simultaneity. So observers traveling at different velocities will regard different sets of events as simultaneous with one another. And in particular, whilst one observer traveling at a particular velocity might regard a particular set of events as present, so they might be the experiential present for this one observer, a different observer moving at a different velocity is going to regard a different set of events as present. So they're going to have a different experiential present, for instance. So another way of putting it is that events that are present with respect to one reference frame might be past or future with respect to other reference frames. And you might think that, well, this is rather difficult to reconcile with the atheoretic view that there's fundamental facts about what is present, right? Can we really believe there's a metaphysical truth about what's present or a metaphysical property of presentness if actually what observers regard as present just depends upon the velocity at which they're traveling, right? So this sort of, in a way, one way of thinking about this is that we're kind of undermining this motivation for thinking that there's an objective present. So the reason for thinking that there was an objective present, or at least one reason, was that we have this experiential present and this experience of a moving present. Now, we looked at reasons why that can't be perfectly accurate, why there must be some, or why it looks like there are some illusions surrounding that. But you might nevertheless think, well, at least roughly the experiential present must correspond to an objective present. The objective present maybe explains why we have the experiences that we do, even if the experiential present doesn't perfectly correspond to the objective present. But I think one reason for maybe being persuaded by this sort of reasoning is the thought that, well, my experiential present is kind of similar to your experiential present and everyone else's experiential present. In other words, we have a kind of intersubjective agreement amongst ourselves about what counts as present. So, for instance, by analogy, hopefully we have a rough agreement subjectively about what objects are part of the external world, right? And that might give us reason for thinking there is an external world. By contrast, when we're dreaming, well, I have a subjective experience, you have a different subjective experience, so we tend not to regard the contents of our dreams as representing anything objective. Now, with respect to time, so, it might seem to us as though actually we've got or at least rough intersubjective agreement about what counts as present, and that might give us cause to think there's such a thing as the objective present. Actually, what special relativity shows us is that this is kind of an artificial agreement. It's only a reflection of the fact that actually most of us are traveling at very similar velocities. If we were all zooming about in rocket ships at very different velocities, we would have very different experiences of what counts as present, and they'd quite radically disagree with one another. So there would be so much disagreement that we might start to question whether there could really be an objective present after all. So we're going to return to various of these themes next week and the week after. So we're going to be continuing our thinking about the philosophy of time, the nature of time. We'll talk a little bit about special relativity as well. But hopefully this lecture has given you a flavour of the sort of the lay of the land of the contemporary debate, this controversy between the A theory and the B theory, and how they're both sort of reactions to McTaggart's argument that time is unreal. And, at least we've started to consider some pros and cons associated with the various views. Okay, so that's it for this week. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you all soon.